Hello, thank you for that, Sir Manawis. Uh, Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Wait, I'll just share my screen. Um, can my PowerPoint be seen? Are we good? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess I'll just jump right into it, no? Hello and good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you for registering and participating in the lecture series, no? Especially this talk for today. As was said, I'm Micah Perez, and today I'll be talking about all of the gymnastics, the weightlifting, and most especially the fencing and the shooting that the Filipino Ilustrados did while they were in Europe in the late 19th century. So let me start by mentioning that the story of this presentation begins with a quote which I actually ran into back in, I think, 2015 or 2016. And it reads, "The handling of a weapon gives moral strength to the individual." Now, it might surprise people to learn that this was something that Jose Rizal wrote in a letter to Antonio Luna in 1890. And I personally found this interesting because our education usually leaves us with an impression of Rizal as a pacifist, an intellectual who ardently believed that the pen was mightier than the sword. Yet here he was in this quote and in this letter advocating for people to become familiar with deadly weapons. So I decided to investigate, and my findings led me to eventually write an article on how the European physical culture, which the Ilustrados participated in, actually fit into the activities and objectives of the propaganda movement, the findings of which I'm sharing through this talk. Also, some of this may already be familiar to a few people in the audience because I've presented earlier versions of this work in other occasions in the past years. So first off, let me describe my method, which was fairly straightforward. I mainly used secondary sources to flesh out the historical context of both the Ilustrado activities on one side and sports in 19th century Europe on the other. Then I used the contents of the letters to and from Rizal to figure out what they actually did and what they thought of these, again, sporting activities. Now, a key term I'd like to clarify first would be sports. I'd like to talk about sports because that's the lens I used when I did this research project. It's what I specialized in and what I'm interested in. Now, modern sports always have this aspect, both a leisure and competitive element to them. The aspect of play keeps it fun for both those playing and those watching, while the competitiveness makes it a very serious undertaking that raises the stakes in any match, okay, or game. However, this was not always the case, no. If you go back to the history of sports, you take a long look at it. At least in Europe, the earliest forms of organized play, again, can be seen in like medieval jousting tournaments, for example, which was a form of preparation for the martial nobility, preparation for warfare. In fact, uh, also it doubled as a huge social event for noble families to interact and jockey for status and prestige. And so fun, entertainment, play while present in these events, it wasn't really the focus. Other aristocratic, leisure activities that would persist long after medieval times would include things like dancing and hunting. Now, while fun and leisurely, these weren't really competitive in nature and they weren't really accessible to a lot of people. For the rest of society, you had games played as part of communal festivals and traditions, such as the earliest forms of medieval football. And there is usually a sacred aspect to them as well, no? Much like the leisure activities of the aristocracy, however, these village versus village matches have little in common with the sports we play and watch today. Um, Modern sports, if you look at them, are very different from those activities. Among its elements, you have a very distinct kind of secularism about them. There's accessibility. There's a specialization of roles for all of the participants involved, even people who aren't playing, like the referees and judges, for example. And there's a heavy emphasis on rationalization. What do I mean by that? Things are measured. Things are always bound to certain parameters of space and time. This gives a certain amount of uniformity to things. Like the shape of the ball, the size of the ball, the weight of the ball is always uniform. The time allotted to matches, etc., etc. There's also a large bureaucracy behind modern sports, no, which shape the leagues and the committees, keeping things uniform and at a level playing field. And finally, of course, there's this knack for record keeping, usually in the shape of statistics or of Hall of Fames and other legacy building elements. So how did we get from this, the aristocratic leisure activities of the past to this? Well, the characteristics of modern sports did not emerge all at once. The transition of at least Western physical cultures from those traditional leisure activities and sacred events to a form of highly competitive mass entertainment was a long process, and most of it occurred throughout the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution, among other things, saw the increase in leisure time for many people as the bourgeois class came into the picture, and the activities that these new, middle class people would get into, these would combine both elite and peasant pastimes in a sense and transform them into unique kinds of cultural activities that would become the predecessor of modern sports as we know them today. So this is the context that my talk will be working in, right? The sports of the Ilustrados that I will be talking about fall under that unique period of transition in the physical culture of 19th century Europe. These activities were more accessible than the aristocratic pastimes of the past centuries, and they also had a competitive aspect that made them distinct from simple childhood games, right? However, they also lack the organization, uniformity, and other elements of modern sports we know and love today, making them something akin to early predecessors, right, of sports. In my own research, I refer to these to the activities of fencing and shooting, for example, as early sports or modernizing sports, at least within the time frame I was working in, to make things easier. So now on to the actual space where all of these activities were happening. Where do people typically do these activities, right? Well, first off, there was school, where students are taught mainly gymnastics as part of their education. Okay, it is important to note, however, that around in the middle of the century, right, gymnastics was a catch-all term for a whole host of activities, including calisthenics, fencing, weightlifting, and more. Most of the educated men would have been familiar with these daily exercises and would often pick up, more specialized disciplines, usually combat activities, to continue to practice, as they grew older. Now, these activities were usually done in gymnasia, which were common in many urban centers across Europe by the time Rizal and company were actually living in Spain. Cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Torino, and Paris began offering access to private gymnastic halls whose founders saw them as both a method of spreading this new physical culture and also as a means of improving people's hygiene within the city. The gymnastic halls became also hubs for social activity and, again, for building relationships. They typically included a closed room, simple, with conditioning equipment like parallel bars, weights, steps, knotted ropes, rings and columns for gymnastic exercises, and an open area for floor exercises, which can also be used for other disciplines such as fencing or boxing. Some gymnasia also had, again, weights for weightlifting and the weightlifting aficionados of the time. Many gymnasia also had dressing rooms and even bathrooms. Another popular activity that didn't need these gymnasia, of course, was shooting, and was done outdoors. And shooting competitions, whether pistol or rifle shooting, they would routinely happen. They were also very popular in Northern Europe, for example. And unlike the hunting expeditions of the aristocracy before, again, these shooting competitions would use pigeons or inanimate objects as targets, right? Because a lot more people are now able to participate in these activities. Also popular as an outdoor activity at the time was also the simple act of walking or hiking. Okay, Rizal himself hiked regularly around Calamba, Laguna when he finished the Noli and in his short trip back home. And walking itself had become a popular pastime among you know the English at the time. Supposedly, the origins of it was rich Englishmen who wanted to walk around their property to see how big it was, and then it became something akin to competitiveness as people wanted to show how far and how fast they could walk compared to their peers. Now, with that overview of the context, right, of the physical culture of the time, let's look at the data, what the Ilustrados actually said, and specifically, or more often than not, Rizal, because he was the one who wrote a lot. Here we have a short excerpt from a very early letter of Jose Rizal, a 15-year-old Rizal, studying in Ateneo and telling his family what he was up to, right? He says, I'm now studying philosophy, physics, and chemistry, natural history, drawing, and gymnastics. So at least in Ateneo and for many other schools, especially in the urbanized center of Manila, you had physical education or an idea of physical education already worked into the curriculum. And the men who would go through this education system would take up gymnastics as a habit and would continue doing gymnastics even when they would eventually go to Europe. Um, a next example I'd like to highlight would be a 28-year-old Rizal when he was in Paris for the Paris Exposition, talking about his typical day, right? So this highlights how regular or how normal it was for people to go to such places, such gymnasia pala. So he says, my daily life in Paris is spent in the following manner. He spends 1 or 2 hours in the gymnasium and in fencing, 3 to 4 in the library, and then the rest he uses up in writing and visiting friends. This is not followed on the days when he would go to visit the exposition, because those days he only had 2 hours at night, and he spends them in the gymnasium and in fencing instead. And thus he says he keeps up with his health. And then he tells his brothers-in-law and his nephews that they should not forget to practice with the bars and the cane, right? And then every other night he says he goes and plays chess with friends at a cafe. So I also highlighted the thing with the brothers-in-law and the nephews because this also shows that the physical culture we are talking about here is not solely in Europe, but there's access to it in the Philippines as well. Although how large that access was, is in doubt. Though it's safe to assume that that's only for the elite, the educated class, those wealthy enough to actually get into schools where this was common practice. By this time, although we know that Rizal himself had tried to set up a gymnasium in Calamba, so this could also be the venue where he was expecting his brothers-in-law and his nephews to be practicing their gymnastics and calisthenics. The next letter I'd like to highlight would be from Antonio Luna to Rizal, okay? Because the context here was Rizal was told by another friend that there was a huge event in Madrid where Filipinos faced off against Spaniards in both shooting and fencing, right? So Rizal wrote to Antonio asking for details. And so Antonio replies, who gave you the news about our battles? And truly, we had admirable luck. This time, Gomez received an apology and a letter from the Count of Asmir. They believe that Gomez is a shooter who kills flies with shots. Captain Urbina also gave Garcia all kinds of apologies in writing after having received a thrashing. And then in short, we cannot ask for more, etc., etc. So parts of the letter would state that there seemed to have been a lot of trash talk, but little action to back it up on the side of the Spaniards. No? So that's Antonio Luna talking. Now, um, of course, Antonio Luna could be exaggerating this, right? But in the same letter, he also talks about how poorly he fared in his own fencing match. And so I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, right? That maybe they really did do very well. It could be, we could know for sure, however, how they fared in this match because apparently this event was covered by the newspaper El Imparcial in Madrid. And I mentioned this because around this time, now between the 1860s to the 1890s, there was an explosive growth in the Spanish press when it comes to um, outlets specializing in sports, the sports press. Okay, and it was an aspect of the regenerationism movement at that time, which was attempting to mirror the English sports craze of the 19th century, where everyone was just trying to do sports, right? There is therefore a possibility of reading more, about the matches of the Filipinos and who they fought against, etc., and their Spanish opponents, right? If someone's able to go through the archives and find these, again, sports papers that actually covered these matches, and I'm pretty sure these matches, not just this match, but all the others were covered because the Ilustrados in Spain, they never failed to invite members of the press to like large events that they think could be associated or were beneficial to the propaganda movement and its objectives, right? So it's somewhere out there. It's a research project waiting to happen. Further on in the same letter, Antonio Luna talks about where people were practicing, and we get an idea, okay, of the dynamics of the cliques, even of where they're going, right? So he says we must prepare for the future. So there's an expectation that these bouts with the Spaniards, other bouts will happen in the future. So in the Carbonell and Sanz Hall are 4 Filipinos, he says: Ponce, Galicano, Puato, and I. Lorente and Zuave and Lete, who according to him is a born shooter but who does not even know how to guard. He says that they shoot in the military center where no one knows anything. So this is interesting because we can find it, almost analogous to like the gyms that we go to, people go to here, in contemporary times. People would prefer some gyms over others, and people would go there as groups. People were known to go there with a group of friends, etc. So sports wasn't just a way for the Ilustrados to directly defeat the Spaniards, however, in a level playing field and physical contest. Excellence in sports also reflected the virtues and the character of the practitioner. And we can see this in Rizal's disciplined practice with his pistols. So here we have an excerpt from the memoirs of Jose Alejandrino, who was one of Rizal's roommates in Brussels while he was writing the El Filibusterismo. And he talks about Rizal's disciplined practice at shooting and how it showed a laudable power of will that speaks of excellent character, right? So he writes that Rizal was addicted to pistol practice, and every month he allotted a certain sum for the purchase of cartridges, figuring out beforehand the number of cartridges, etc., which he could spare daily. He never saw Rizal fire a single bullet in excess of what he had allotted for his daily practice. Rizal himself would attribute his improvement in pistol shooting with perseverance, right? And self-discipline. He says, writing to Antonio Luna, I go to the clinic, I read, I write, I go to the gymnasium and the fencing hall. As to shooting, with this, I am sending you a cardboard with 10 bullet holes. He describes the board 7.5 meters away from me at a distance of 25 meters. And then he put 20 shots inside the board, 20 centimeters high and 20 centimeters wide. He says that I go slowly, but through perseverance, I will be able to shoot fairly well. And I will supplement with my will the few qualities of a shooter that nature has given me. So may pagka, there's a bit of a humble brag here on Rizal. As a side note, Rizal actually had the habit of sending his targets to his friends. He also sent like a cardboard target to Valentin Ventura, for example, who replied in a letter that, and here I'm quoting directly from his letter, the card you sent me is beautiful, showing that you have control of your pulse. For although you have not hit many times the bullseye, all the holes are on one side of the card. I do not know at what distance you hit the card, because if you have done it at 25 paces, I will not be the one to challenge you to a pistol duel. Okay. So here and in other letters to the other reformists of the propaganda movement, we find that the Ilustrados, and Rizal especially, would readily connect excellence in their physical disciplines with, again, personal virtues, right? Desirable virtues. And it shouldn't be surprising, since European physical culture in the 19th century did much the same. Okay. Um, at the time, activities in the gymnasia were associated with a very masculine ideal of civilization and modernity. Proper form and constant practice of gymnastics exercises, for example, showcased mastery of the self. So too did the self-discipline necessary in shooting practice if someone wanted to become good. Fencing also showcased this similar self-discipline, but additionally showed the ability to overcome challenges in the form of pain, stress, and even the opponent himself. So keeping one's school under pressure, always being logical, having a great self-control, were back then thought of as the hallmarks of a rational and therefore modern man. This becomes important when we recall that the propaganda movement animated a range of reactions from their opposition, usually driven by racist ideologies and subsequently imposed racist identities. They were called cowards, likened to monkeys, accused of effeminacy, savagery, filth, and indolence. And they responded to these charges not just through intellectual achievements or polemics printed in La Solidaridad, but also in a very meticulous stylishness in their fashion and in their appearance, and through manly courage and honor as implied heavily by their excellence in the disciplines of their choice within the physical culture of Europe at the time. And this excellence went beyond mere participation in that culture. It actually went all the way to the fact that they could stand toe to toe with the Spaniards, and they could even beat them sometimes when they would have these friendly bouts of fencing and shooting. So excellence in fencing and pistol shooting in particular, which were the most competitive of these physical activities, became emphatic rebuttals against these charges from their opponents. And it's something that was not lost on them, right? We see here, for example, Juan Luna writing to Rizal in 1890, how he appreciated the reputation which fencing had given the young men from the Philippines at the time. He says in the first letter that he went on vacation for a month. He saw almost the entire Filipino colony, and while some are studios and others gamblers and loafers, the good thing is that all of them had taken up fencing through the influence of Antonio, his brother. And the Filipinos now enjoy the fame of being brave and strong in the handling of weapons. In another letter, he says that you must have noticed among our compatriots much fondness for arms, and it might be desirable for you to hold another bout so that this kind of sport would make of the Filipino youth a bunch of ready fighters. Let's see. Now, of course, reputations, for them to survive, the habits that produced them had to be maintained. And Rizal, if we recall, was well known for dishing out a lot of criticism to the Filipinos in Madrid while he was actually out of the country writing the El Filibusterismo. Part of that criticism was against how the newest batch of men from the Philippines seemed to him, at least, be busier with gambling at the card table than doing anything actually productive for the country. So he tried to repeatedly push them towards fencing as an alternative leisure activity, especially with the reputation that Antonio Luna and his cohort had already built for the Filipinos in Madrid. And that was the context of the quote that I started this talk with. No, it was a letter from Rizal to Luna stating that I felicitate cordially all of you, and especially you, for the happy and brilliant fencing bout you held in the studio of your brother. So here we have an idea. No, it's not just in the gymnasium hall. They actually organized a fencing bout, right, in the studio of Juan Luna the painter. So they must have moved all of the materials aside, all of the paintings aside, and then clear the space so that they can go at it. Now, Rizal continues that it is good for the youth to devote themselves to something more serious and noble than the game of cards. And as Marco Espada says very well, the handling of a weapon gives moral strength to the individual, making him prudent and moderate. Okay, so here we see Rizal's insistence that the youth leave gambling behind in favor of the sword, or perhaps even the pistol, with the implied belief that this will help in improving their self-discipline. Rizal's vision wasn't just limited to the Filipinos abroad, though. He also envisioned bringing European physical culture and its associated virtues back to the Philippines. We can see this clearly in his ideal school setup as portrayed in the Noli Me Tangere, where the plans of Crisosto Ibarra School in San Diego were described. The school was supposed to include a gymnasium, an open space for games, and a track for running races and jumping in the open air. It even described how something akin to detention should be done in a room that either overlooked these areas or was in hearing distance of these areas, so that the naughty kids could look on at their peers in envy while they played outside, no? Pushing them somehow to, I guess, reflect on what they had done. Rizal himself also opened up, as I said before, a gymnasium in his hometown of Calamba, Laguna during his brief return to the Philippines. After he wrote the Noli and before he started writing the Philly, he describes this gymnasium to Blumentritt in a letter in 1887 thus, no? I give vacation to my patients and my gymnasium pupils. May I tell you that I have popularized here physical exercises so that the gamblers, instead of going to the cockpit or sitting down at the pangingi table, would come to the gymnasium to watch the exercises or even join them. Through this also, some ailments were cured. So again, Rizal patting himself a bit on the back there, but we see why, the reasons why he would do that. He was trying to, again, bring in not just health and hygiene, but also certain virtues to combat against the vice of gambling. When Rizal was eventually exiled in Dapitan, he also made sure that the school he built had weightlifting and swimming as part of its curriculum. So if anything, at this point, we can be sure that Rizal took the Latin phrase, again, mens sana in corpore sano to heart, a sound mind in a sound body, right? Rizal wasn't the only one to bring something back from Spain, however. So while he introduced what we can associate as an early form of physical education to the areas outside of urbanized Manila, right? Antonio Luna, on the other hand, brought home the earliest form of modern sport, fencing. When the Luna brothers eventually arrived back in the Philippines, Antonio Luna opened Sala Armas in Calle Alex in Sampaloc, Manila, no? Modeled after the French fencing salons in Paris, we can see at least in the few pictures we have of it, there were a lot of, again, students, trying to take up fencing with him. But this fencing salon wasn't even in operation for a year, if my math is correct, before the Katipunan was soon discovered and the Luna brothers implicated, so they get thrown into jail. Now, at this point, some of you may be wondering how this fits into the history lecture series theme regarding reclamations and disruptions, right? Well, in terms of disruptions, if one looks at the intersection of sports history on one hand and colonial history on the other, you'll actually find a pattern with how sports have spread across the globe. So usually the educated elites of the colonized society would pick up the sports from the center of colonial power, usually in Europe or with the colonial powers in the colonies themselves, right? Then they bring it back to their own countries or their own communities. And as it spreads in popularity, this creates a unique sporting culture or even a style of play that becomes quite distinct from the original and thus becomes a cultural element forming a part of their national identity. This can most easily be seen in the spread of British sports like cricket and rugby. And in a lesser extent, I guess, or less obvious extent, we can also see this in countries that have adopted the American sport of baseball, for example, like Japan and Puerto Rico. Right? So in the case of Ilustrado fencing and shooting, these elements of European society, which were heavily associated with the experience of modernity, were treated by these Ilustrados as a means to be taken seriously by their Spanish counterparts, to progress their country forward as well, in a sense, especially with Rizal and the Lunas, no, teaching others all of these, weightlifting, swimming, teaching them fencing, etc. And also, in a sense, to build a certain kind of national identity, which was separate from what their detractors were saying the Filipinos were: indolent, savage, backwards, right? The sense of nation that they were trying to create here was very, very much in according to the standards of the Europeans at that time. Very rational, very self-controlled, and also with this sort of macho, machismo type of masculinity that was prevalent amongst the Filipino colony at the time. Early 19th century sports were first introduced to them, again, through educational institutions, which they attended. Later on, these were reinforced by the popular physical culture in Europe, before ultimately becoming a means of sort of communication between them, allowing these young men to project their understanding of modern masculinity to both the colonial metropole and among themselves. Okay? The Ilustrados adopted these foreign sports cultures because of their twofold promise of modernity on one hand and a means to navigate the colonial power relationship in the other. However, the potential development along similar avenues to other colonized countries was never fully realized during Spanish time, since the Revolution of 1896 broke out and the subsequent years of fighting disrupted this sort of cultural transmigration of sports from Europe to the Philippines. The American victory in the Filipino-American War would then effectively restart the process of introducing modern sports to the Filipino people. And that is why, at least in my argument, our current sports culture reflects the American model rather than a European one. Anyway, to conclude, Ilustrado participation in European physical culture, especially the modernizing sports of fencing and shooting, was an active and performative aspect of the propaganda movement. Through the values of European society associated with these activities, the Filipinos of the movement, the Ilustrados, imagined a specific kind of identity for themselves, one that could stand up to and even beat Europeans at their own game, especially the Spaniards. However, this national identity that was being formed was incredibly masculine, which is like the big caveat here of this entire historical narrative. It was formed along idealized masculine ideals of 19th century Europe that attributed a lot of the desired values of modern civilization to the perfect male character: logical, disciplined, in control of one's faculties, not just brilliant, but also highly physical, and in control always of their emotions at all times, and thus able to overcome hardships and the challenges of the world, right? Which contrasted a lot with not just the stereotypes of the effeminate ideal, right? Emotional, illogical, etc. But also contrasted to what was seen as backwards or uncivilized. Again, savages who cannot control their base impulses. Okay. So with that, I end the talk. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't bore any of you. And I guess I'll ask for the moderators what will happen next. Thank you very much.